Hello, everyone. We'll get started here in just about a minute. Thank you for joining. Hello all, and welcome to our sixth session of the Just Wage Forum 2021. My name is Kelly Reagan, and I'm a research associate in Catholic social tradition at the Center for Social Concerns here at the University of Notre Dame. I'm also a budding member of the Higgins Labor Program, directed by Dan Graff. Named for Catholic priest, labor economist, and union advocate Monsignor George Higgins, the Higgins Labor Program explores questions about work, the politics of work, and the work of social justice, all through the lens of Catholic social teaching, which emphasizes such principles as the dignity of work, the right of everyone not only to decent work, but also a voice in the workplace, and a commitment to the common good. The Higgins Labor Program is housed at Notre Dame Center for Social Concerns, where students, faculty, and staff collaborate with community partners to fuse their efforts in the heart and the head for the cause of social inclusion and justice. So many thanks to all of you for joining us today. The Higgins Labor Program's major research project is the Just Wage Initiative, which probes the foundational question rooted in Catholic social teaching. What makes any given wage just or unjust? The major fruit of that research is our new Just Wage framework and online tool, a resource for professors, policymakers, and practitioners to reflect and dialogue upon just wage questions, and hopefully come away committed to contributing to a fairer, more inclusive, more sustainable, more just economy. Our Just Wage framework consists of 7 interrelated criteria. As part of the Just Wage Forum, we're hosting expert scholars and practitioners and collecting their insights, expectations, and concerns regarding the prospects of a more just economy. In each session, we focus on one of the 7 Just Wage criteria, with short presentations by both a scholar researcher and a practitioner or activist, in the spirit of bridging the academic and advocacy realms, and in the hopes of starting not only new conversations, but also new initiatives. We began the forum on February 12th, where we introduced the Just Wage framework and heard from Don Stabile, who historicized conceptions of the living wage. We then explored criterions 1, 2, and 3 in succession and discussed how a just wage promotes a decent life, promotes asset building, and provides social security. About 3 weeks ago, we focused on criterion 4 of the Just Wage framework, which suggests that a just wage is free from discrimination and fosters inclusion. We heard powerful presentations by Charles Hurst, Assistant Professor of Management at the Mendoza College of Business here at the University of Notre Dame, and Mona Lisa, a Notre Dame alumna and business and human rights attorney in India. Connie Mick, the Director of Academic Affairs and of the Poverty Studies Interdisciplinary Minor at the Center for Social Concerns, responded with a thought-provoking reflection. If you missed any of these sessions or would like to revisit them, you can access the video from the Just Wage Forum website. Our next session on June 11th at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time is devoted to Criterion 6, a just wage enables participation. We look forward to presentations by Naomi Williams, Assistant Professor at Rutgers University's School of Management and Labor Relations, Damon Silvers, Director of Policy and Special Counsel at the AFL-CIO, and Higgins labor enthusiast Kevin Cristiano, Associate Professor of Sociology here at the University of Notre Dame. We hope you'll join us and help spread the word. Today, our focus is Criterion 5 of the Just Wage framework. A just wage is not excessive. As we see it, a just wage structure within an organization features a policy inhibiting extreme inequality between the highest and lowest earners. It promotes the sustainability of the enterprise in the long-term interests of all stakeholders. More broadly, a just wage exhibits proportionality within a wider economic community. I encourage you to visit our website to learn more about this criterion, as we've put together a series of resource pages organized into the following categories. What does Catholic social teaching say? What does the research show? What is the law? and who does it well. In a few crisp paragraphs, each resource page includes the topic and points the reader to other resources for deeper exploration. Before we turn to the main event, a note about protocol and participation. We will devote about 20 minutes to each of the presentations of our featured speakers, followed by about 15 minutes of conversation between them and a member of our Just Wage working group. We'll then have 25 minutes for discussion where attendees are encouraged to ask questions. To raise a question or to offer a comment, we ask that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to prioritize and address as many of those questions as we can. For those we don't get to, we can always follow up outside of the session via email. A warm thanks again to all of you for joining us today, and many thanks too to all of those who make the Just Wage Forum possible. Many of you are familiar with our first featured speaker, Dan Graff. Dan is the director of the Higgins Labor Program at the Center for Social Concerns here at Notre Dame, where he co-convenes the Just Wage Initiative. He holds a faculty joint appointment in the Department of History, where he teaches a variety of courses in US and labor history, and keeps a diverse research portfolio mixing explorations into contemporary and historical labor topics. Dan's presentation this afternoon is titled "The United States Automobile Workers' Forgotten 1958 Fight Against Excess Profits and Economic Amnesia in the Contemporary USA." Dan, would you like to take the floor?
Thanks so much, Kelly. And thanks to everyone for joining today. I want to single Kelly Reagan out, who's just a new member of the Center for Social Concern staff this past year and has become a core indispensable member of the Just Wage Working Group. So I want to thank her for her efforts all year and for hosting today's session. A just wage is not excessive. One of 7 core criteria making up our just wage framework, it's the one that's generated perhaps the most interest, both pro and con. As you likely are all aware, we live in an era of increasing economic income and wealth inequality, where wages, when adjusted for inflation, have been flat for most workers for 4 decades, even as productivity has continued to increase. The result has been more of the nation's economic growth translating into corporate profits rather than workers' wages, even as wage gains skew upward to the top 5% and even more to the top 1%. These are widely known facts, so you might think they would inform our policy debates and perhaps produce measures channeling more profits into wages and more private gains into public goods. But contemporary Americans struggle with accepting excessiveness as a vice, and many prefer to see the sky as the limit, viewing a lack of economic ceilings as the heart of what makes America unique and somehow uniquely better than other places. In presentations of our just wage framework over the past few years, several people have suggested to me getting rid of the excessiveness criterion altogether, because they see it as either a political non-starter or in this very hyper-individualistic American culture, or they view it as a personal affront to their opportunity to rise as an American, I guess to become the next Jeff Bezos. It's that discomfort that so many Americans have about confronting excessiveness and massive inequality that led me back to the past to explore how earlier Americans confronted such questions. In addition to directing the Higgins Labor Program here at Notre Dame, I also teach US labor history, where each year my students express shock when we explore Walter Reuther, president of the United Auto Workers, ally of Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, and one of the major architects of the mass middle-class society the US came close to realizing in the first 3 decades after World War II. They're shocked, that is, because they've never heard of Walter Reuther. How could an individual so central, so important to 20th century history of the United States have dropped so completely from our public memory and only 50 years after his untimely death? Well, our collective forgetting about Reuther, I think, is linked to our broader collective forgetting about the critical role the labor movement has played in curbing excessive wealth in this country, especially during its period of most widely shared prosperity. So today I hope to resurrect the ghost of Walter Reuther and his battle against what he called excess profits, in the hopes of helping us think about ways to confront the increasing economic inequality we confront today. But I'll start with a little more recent history. In January 2019, when newly elected Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez suggested in a 60 Minutes interview that top income earners should pay a marginal tax rate higher than the current 37%, the response by some of her colleagues, especially Republicans, bordered on incredulity. Veteran Louisiana Congressman Steve Scalise, for example, accused AOC of wanting to tax 70% of individuals' entire earnings, when in reality she was proposing to tax at that rate only any income earned above $10 million. AOC tweeted a reply to Scalise, quote, "You're the GOP minority whip. How do you not know how marginal tax rates work?" It's highly doubtful, of course, that Scalise was unaware of the essentials of progressive taxation. His primary aim was to delegitimize Ocasio-Cortez's agenda, which he described as, quote, "take away 70% of your income and give it to leftist fantasy programs." More likely, Scalise and other GOP leaders hope to play on the confusion of their constituents about marginal tax rates, what journalist Jason Linkins has called, quote, "an area where opportunistic deceivers thrive at the expense of honest people," unquote. Indeed, surveys consistently show that while Americans overwhelmingly favor having the rich pay more in taxes than they currently do, they also remain largely uninformed and unaware of how tax policy actually works, leaving them prey for those who would exploit their ignorance. This Twitter tempest between AOC and her opponents, in other words, was just one brief, vivid example of a broader, increasingly frequent feature of a contemporary American political debate: willful attempts to misrepresent policies promoting fairness and which lead to widespread economic amnesia throughout the country. For much of the 20th century, in fact, Americans did successfully confront massive private wealth and extreme income inequality through labor unions, anti-monopoly government regulation, and progressive taxation. But for the past 40 years, those efforts have been largely abandoned, and now apparently mostly forgotten. In the 1950s, the highest earning Americans paid over 90% on anything they made above $2.5 million in today's dollars. And this, the 1950s, was during the two-term presidency of Republican Dwight Eisenhower. But today, the idea of a progressive income tax, what was an uncontroversial and bipartisan democratic capitalist practice 6 decades ago, is attacked by prominent conservatives and pundits as not only wrong-headed, but also un-American. The differences between that era and ours go beyond Twitter and tax rates, of course, and you see before you the rise and fall of the top marginal tax rate. But a related, if neglected, gulf concerns the presence and power of the labor movement, which today is a shell of its former self, with unions representing only 1 in 10 American workers. Conversely, in the Eisenhower era, unions were at the apogee of their strength, as 1 in 3 eligible workers enjoyed collective bargaining agreements. Moreover, unlike now, union leaders were well-known public figures who played significant roles in both policymaking and agenda setting, whether at the workplace or in national politics. And their consistent appearances in newspaper articles, magazine profiles, radio programs, and the like lent a highly visible legitimacy to working people as an important public interest group. Moreover, they helped convert at least some corporate profits into workers' wages, helping create more widely shared prosperity. A personification of organized labor's mid-century might was indeed Walter Reuther, who as president of the UAW from 1946 to 1970 was the most visible, forceful, and imaginative American union leader of the post-war era. A pioneer in the industrial union upsurge that transformed American labor relations in the midst of the depths of the Great Depression and during World War II in the fight against fascism, Reuther led the UAW into the post-war promised land through a series of contracts that carried auto workers into the working middle class. By the 1950s, the UAW's collective bargaining agreements with the big three automakers delivered not just higher pay, but innovations like cost of living adjustments, company-provided healthcare and pensions, and supplemental unemployment benefits to build on the government programs that covered all. On January 20th, 1958, 6 decades before Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez appeared on 60 Minutes, Reuther was the featured guest on a forerunner to that long-running news program, ABC's The Mike Wallace Interview. The topic was Reuther's proposed profit-sharing plan, which the UAW had just unveiled as they prepared to head into contract negotiations that year. Calling attention to what he termed the auto industry's excess profits, Reuther demanded their conversion into not only higher wages for his members, but also lower prices for consumers. The proposal earned widespread public attention throughout the first half of 1958, leading one leading business journal to predict that, quote, some of the fundamental issues it raises will be with the American people for a long time to come. Yet it is largely dropped from our collective memory. Historians have devoted little energy to Reuther's profit-sharing proposal, mostly because the UAW ended up shelving it in the face of a pretty serious economic recession, as well as fierce management resistance. Ultimately, the 1958 collective bargaining agreements did prolong the good benefits and wages that made auto work the gold standard of post-war working class jobs, but they failed to address that excess profits issue raised so insistently by Reuther months before. Today, though, I'm interested less in the failure of that proposal's adoption and more in how the plan, and importantly, the public attention that was devoted to it, show us how Americans of an earlier age engaged fundamental questions of excessiveness and economic fairness. Beyond the reminder that our current debates over inequality and excessiveness are nothing new, an investigation of Reuther and the UAW's long-forgotten proposal shows two things. On the one hand, we can see a continuity from then to now in the opposition of business elites, conservative politicians, and the mainstream media when confronted by claims to greater economic fairness. On the other hand, we see a clear disjuncture between that era and ours in terms of the representation of workers' interests in public debates. In short, this lost moment in the history of American anti-excessiveness suggests, I would say, the indispensability of independent working class organizations for those who hope to bend the US economy in a fairer, more equitable direction. Briefly, the UAW's profit-sharing proposal planned to take all before tax annual profits above 10% of net capital, the excess profits that Reuther decried, and split them 3 ways, with 50% still being retained by the corporation, while the other half would be distributed as 25% to workers as bonuses of some form, and 25% to car buyers as rebates. Rewarding all the stakeholders who contributed to the company's success, Reuther declared, quote, we say that workers, consumers, and stockholders should all share in getting the equity out of the fruits of our advancing technology, unquote. At the same time, putting more money into the pockets of ordinary auto workers and customers whose spending would then spur further demand for other goods and services would increase the country's purchasing power, Reuther's longtime favorite phrase for promoting national economic growth and widespread prosperity. Now, whatever the merits actually of the plan, and some of your heads may be swimming trying to figure out how and whether it might actually work, Reuther's appearance on national television was indicative of the widespread coverage the press devoted to the UAW's plan throughout 1958, which kept the American people informed of the debate over excess profits more broadly. While the loudest voices in that very public conversation, the press and the business class, strongly opposed the UAW's plan as not just unrealistic, but even irresponsible, Here you see the Chicago Tribune's editorial cartoon. Just as important is the fact that they covered it at all and felt obligated to react and respond to it. And this wasn't the only time. Throughout the post-war decades, Reuther and the UAW ceaselessly churned out new ideas, always giving the press something to cover and consistently making executives defend the economic status quo. Such efforts gave visibility to the interests of working people and helped the UAW and the labor movement more broadly play a role in shaping the national conversation on the economy, and that is shaping the economic agenda. As the press reprinted, reported on, argued with, and criticized Reuther's public speeches, press conferences, convention addresses, and congressional testimony, the realm of the economically and politically possible sometimes widened and at least remained open from the 1940s into the 1970s. In short, by showcasing a leader who gave assertive voice to workers' concerns on the shop floor, at the bargaining table, and in policymaking venues, news coverage, even when it was unfriendly, made very visible working class values of decent work, solidarity, and economic fairness. When radio listeners, television viewers, newspaper readers, and rally goers witnessed the very public collective bargaining engaged in by Reuther and the UAW, much to the chagrin of auto executives who preferred the venue of the private bargaining table out of the public view, these Americans also vividly experienced, and no doubt sometimes participated in, fundamental debates over not just the proper way to split profits, but also the right ways to share power in a capitalist economy. Americans today might deem it audacious for a labor union to purport to play such a prominent role in a private company's decision-making processes, and even more, to claim that the destination of profits should be deliberated democratically and awarded collectively, rather than individually. Similarly, they might find it audacious to envision labor unions, given their much shrunken presence today, as vehicles that could curb excess profits. Today, those who challenge excessiveness tend to think largely, if not exclusively, in terms of redistributing profits via progressive taxation. The recent Twitter tempest occasioned by AOC, for example, centered on her desire to raise marginal tax rates, something the Biden administration is addressing again. In 1958, on the other hand, Reuther's proposed vehicle to curb excess profits was not the IRS, but the UAW, whose members would police profits and then try to bend them at the bargaining table toward wages and rebates through the collective bargaining process. But audacity is a reflection of familiarity, just as imagination is bounded by an awareness of the possible. Thus, 90% marginal tax rates weren't considered that audacious in 1958, though they were certainly contested by many. Unions, too, were ensconced in the political and economic landscape in 1958, even though their proper functions and power were also widely debated. But collaboratively, unions and government policies funded by progressive taxation tended to work in tandem throughout the era to redistribute profits as wages, both individual and social. And this is something that today's government advocates of attacking excess profits and income inequality must bear in mind. Passing pro-worker policies at the legislative level today will likely depend on strong and independent pro-worker organizations to provide not only votes, but also voices to expand our currently restricted political imaginations. 6 decades before Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was sworn in as the youngest woman ever elected to Congress, also in January and at the US Capitol, UAW President Walter Reuther was sworn in as the first witness in the Senate Judiciary Committee's antitrust subcommittee investigating automobile pricing. As the New York Times reported with seemingly grudging admiration, quote, Mr. Reuther arrived at the packed hearing room with a 110-page prepared statement, a 7-page supplement, 29 tables, and 7 pages of corrections for the prepared material, but he testified from handwritten notes. He talked about the auto industry, the economy in general, the Cold War, aid to India, farmers, and education, unquote. Reuther's wide-ranging and bravura two-day performance, as well as the data, the analysis, and the reports undergirding it, were the fruits of research and creativity only made possible by the dues of 1.3 million members of the United Auto Workers. That was 1958. It remains an open question today how working people and their advocates might mobilize their collective resources and imaginations to play a role in shaping public discourse and policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Our next presentation will feature two speakers, Joan Neal and Sister Emily TeKolste. Joan and Emily are members of Network, Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. Network was founded by Catholic sisters in the progressive spirit of Vatican II. As a Catholic leader in the global movement for justice and peace, Network educates, organizes, and lobbies for economic and social transformation. Joan Neal is the Senior Fellow for Governmental Relations and Strategy at Network. In that capacity, she lobbies Congress on justice system reform through the lens of restorative justice. She also leads strategic initiatives such as the organizational theory of change, as well as its racial equity and justice work. Joan has a background in organizational development, management, and financial services, and has held senior leadership positions in both nonprofit and business organizations. Emily TeKolste is a member of Providence of St. Mary of the Woods, Indiana. Originally from Indianapolis, she joined the Sisters of Providence in 2016. She has been working as an organizer at Network for 2 years and works with advocate teams and leaders in Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Missouri, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Joan and Emily will speak about tax policy and creating just wages. Welcome to you both. And Joan, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Kelly, for that kind introduction. I am really so very pleased to be with you this afternoon to participate in this important discussion of a just wage and an equitable society. I'm going to follow up on Dan's presentation by contributing some thoughts about the role of public policy, specifically tax policy, in contributing to or detracting from a just economy. As Kelly said, Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice is a public policy shop. We were both the first, and possibly we are still the only, Catholic social justice lobby organization in the United States. As both a charitable and a social welfare organization, an IRS designation of C3 and C4, our staff includes registered professional lobbyists who lobby on Capitol Hill on economic, social, racial, and gender justice issues. We were founded by Catholic sisters nearly 50 years ago. And today, our organization includes lay women and men in DC and around the country. And our mission is to shape federal policies that ensure a country rooted in justice, equity, and dignity for all. Our new Build Anew agenda calls for federal policies that dismantle systemic racism, eliminate the wealth and income gap, improve the well-being of communities, and allow all people to thrive. So in addition to issues like democracy reform and healthcare and food security, immigration and justice system reform, we also work on tax policy. We do that work precisely because tax policy is central to a just society and is a major factor in the economic security of workers, owners, managers, shareholders, and consumers alike, and contributes to the possibility and the probability of a just wage. In society, we know everyone must bear their fair share of community burdens in order to share equitably in society's benefits. The tax code's primary purpose, then, is to collect sufficient revenue for the government to support public investments in our shared national priorities and to create an environment where everyone can thrive. The problem is that our income tax code is not, nor has it ever been, neutral. Like many systems and structures in the United States, The tax code was and still is written by mostly men, white, non-Hispanic men, who historically have controlled the majority of financial resources in this country, both at the individual and the corporate level, and who today are overrepresented in the wealthiest households, directly causing the devaluation of the labor of women, especially women of color. Consequently, the code embodies gender and racial biases because of our history of discrimination against women and people of color. It is an economic structure that undermines rather than supports the ability for all people to not only survive, but thrive. Our tax code preferences income from wealth over income from work by, for example, cuts to the top marginal tax rates, special treatment like the estate tax and the capital gains tax, and a much reduced corporate effective tax rate. Our tax code incentivizes accumulation of wealth and other behaviors that benefit top earners at the expense of other employees. Among other things, favorable tax treatment allowed CEO pay, for instance, to outpace average workers' pay by a factor of 320 to 1 in 2019. That is outrageous. It has also spawned self-aggrandizing activities like rent seeking, which is a phenomenon by which highly paid employees and companies receive more compensation than their labor contributions would be worth in the marketplace. In other words, these are people who are paid more than their labor is worth. This practice in particular trickles down and negatively affects mostly women and women of color specifically, who are often stuck in very low-paying jobs, many without benefits, and who lack the same bargaining power as these highly paid employees. So such activities as these create work environments of disproportionality, where there is extreme inequality between the highest and the lowest earners. The whole focus on maximizing shareholder value in corporations leads to short-term decisions by management and boards that often come at the expense of frontline jobs, leaving many workers not only unable to earn a livable wage, but often results in high unemployment. And we've seen that over this past year during the COVID-19 pandemic. Additionally, practices like misclassification of jobs and non-compete clauses in employment contracts, suppression of employee unionization and collective bargaining, and corporate-driven globalization have all contributed to a growing wage gap and employment insecurity, much of which is perfectly fine behavior under the current tax code. So over the last 40 years, it has become clearer and clearer that rising economic inequality is not the result of benign market forces, but is the result of distinct and intentional policy choices. These choices have empowered employers to systematically undercut workers' ability to earn livable wages, higher pay, obtain economic security, and better quality jobs. But there is a good news side of this story, and that is that tax policy can also reduce and mitigate economic, gender, and racial injustice, and help to close the income and wealth gap. That's why taxes and tax policy are critical tools in achieving a just and equitable society. Now, there's lots of research as well as real-life experience about the myriad of issues that have been created by this tax system that has been deliberately rigged to benefit the wealthy few and disadvantage those of us who actually make up the economy by our productivity and economic activity. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to cover all of those things here. But with a few minutes that I have left, let me explain or mention a couple of policy solutions that help to address some of the issues and narrow the gaps. Because we need tax policies that level out the playing field and begin to shift some of the power back to workers and their families. Specifically, we need to raise reasonable revenue to make investments in our shared society and reduce the deficit by reforming the tax code's wealth preference. We can do that by using a combination of tax subsidies plus spending programs, like investments to defray the cost of education, childcare, incentivized paid family and medical leave, and housing supports that both have subsidies and make affordable housing more available, to name just a few. We can require everyone to pay their fair share. We can do this by reforming the tax code and redesigning exemptions, deductions, and tax breaks that largely benefit high income, mostly white households, and reconfiguring them to include women, people of color, and other marginalized groups. We can raise the top marginal tax rates and institute a wealth tax on the top 1% of incomes. We can tax capital like work, close corporate loopholes, raise the estate tax rate and substantially lower that exemption. We can tax inheritances when they are received instead of allowing them to pass untaxed from generation to generation. And we can expand tax credits, especially the refundable ones, to low income and moderate income taxpayers to create a more equitable and economically secure society and fairer tax code. We can do this by expanding refundable tax credits like the EITC, which is designed to support work and workers, and the CTC, the child tax credit, which helps families meet the costs of raising children. We should also reform the CTC so that single parent households can receive the same amount of tax credit as married households. Children should not be penalized because of the relationship status of their parents. And we should make the CTC permanent, as well as lower the eligibility income for the CD-CTC, the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit, which is a non-refundable tax subsidy that currently primarily benefits mostly higher income households only because the threshold of income and expenses is often too high for low-income families to meet. Now, the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities recently estimated that the EITC and the ACTC, the Additional Child Care Tax Credit, kept 7.9 million people out of poverty in 2018, including 4.2 million children. And recently, the Biden administration stated that their expansion of the child tax credit would cut child poverty in half. So clearly, these tax credits can go a long way toward leveling the playing field and restoring proportionality in the economy. But in addition to tax credits and reform of the tax code itself, we must adequately fund IRS enforcement so that they can ensure compliance with these changes and discourage the invention of loopholes. Finally, one of the most impactful things the government can do, aside from fixing the tax code, is to pass a livable federal minimum wage as soon as possible. So these are just a few of the ways that tax policy and the tax code can either promote and enhance economic justice and an inclusive society, or further divide it. In their 1986 pastoral letter, Economic Justice for All, the US bishops wrote, "The economy should work for people and not people for the economy." These changes in tax policy will get us closer to that vision. Congress can make these changes happen with their vote and with a stroke of a legislative pen. And they should do it now. For us, we will continue to do our part and advocate until they do. Thank you. And now I'd like to turn it over to Sister Emily TeKolste, Network's Grassroots Mobilization Coordinator, who will talk about how our national network of constituent lobbyists bring their voices to bear on these justice issues. Emily?
Thank you, Joan. And thank you for doing such a beautiful job laying out the policy implications of tax policy. Not typically the most exciting piece, not something that most justice advocates have traditionally focused on, but critical to the work that we do. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we get there. Joan and her colleagues on the government relations team play an important piece of that role, doing the direct lobbying with Congress. They meet to talk about all sorts of issues, including taxes, within the framework of the Build a New Agenda. And we say that we need to build our nation anew on the cornerstones of dismantling systemic racism, cultivating inclusive community, rooting our economy in solidarity, and transforming our politics. And so in addition to tax policy, we work on protecting and preserving our democracy, transforming our immigration and justice systems, and ensuring everyone has access to healthcare, housing, and food through the policies that we create on a federal level. The government relations team does so much work and builds so many relationships with staff on the Hill, congressional staff. And in addition to that, we also engage constituents in direct advocacy. We have two teams that bear the burden, the joy and the burden of that work. One is my team, the Grassroots Mobilization team, and the other is the communications team. We have a network of thousands of constituent lobbyists across the nation who take action via email action alerts. We also have folks that are members of teams. And so we work together to educate, organize, and lobby for economic and social transformation. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about the organizing model that the Grassroots Mobilization team uses at Network. We are currently building teams to do the work of advocacy on federal legislation. And so the team model is an important piece of what we do. We know that the work of justice is so much more fun, more engaging, more fulfilling, and more sustainable when it's done in community. And so we have statewide teams in places like Indiana. We also have local teams in places like Pennsylvania, where we have two teams, an Erie team and a Philadelphia team, on opposite sides of the state. And the unique benefit that this moment has given to us is the ability to shift so much of the work that we do online, which enables us to create connections across the nation. The teams that we work with directly lobby their representatives through meetings. They've also become more and more active in the world of writing letters to the editor and op-eds, of hosting educational events and bringing these conversations out into their communities. And we at Network support this work through providing educational opportunities to enable them to feel more confident writing letters to the editor, to have the understanding of the policy that they need in order to become effective advocates and to change the community conversation. One of my favorite things about my job is the workshops that we are able to do. And the space of moving everything online has really opened up some really phenomenal opportunities. We've moved our racial wealth and income gap and transformative conversations into online models and have been able to host so many of those in this past year. We had our first ever virtual lobby day just about a week ago, where we had 120 constituents from across the nation visiting 50 congressional offices. So far, that's yielded 10 new co-sponsors of the Equal Act, which addresses drug disparities in sentencing between crack and powder cocaine. And we work with our advocates teams to help them understand more fully the implications of the policies, the society in which we live, and to build the skills in order to change that. Our core constituent group is mostly wealthier, whiter, and older than the general population. We do have many Catholic sisters who are engaged, but we've expanded over the past few decades significantly, and the majority of our supporters are not Catholic sisters anymore. We have interfaith and bipartisan teams doing the work of justice, but generally our folks are faith motivated, Generally, our folks are able to have some flexibility in their time to enable them to participate in all sorts of opportunities. A lot of retired folks, although a lot of folks that are still working as well. Last night we had a community conversation, which is a new model that we have been doing with the field since our virtual Nuns on the Bus event this past election season. This is a nationwide conversation where folks are able to come together and reflect together on a specific topic. And last night we talked about the dignity of work and the rights of workers. Talked about the inherent dignity of work, providing a reflection on the theological underpinnings and the right of people to be treated, of all workers to be treated with dignity. We talked about some specific policies that would specifically protect workers. Joan talked a little bit about some of the tax policies that we are supporting, but we're also working on the worker side of things with things like the Citizenship for Essential Workers Act, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, and the Protecting the Right to Organize, or PRO Act. And finally, most exciting is that we are getting ready next week on Wednesday to unveil a brand new workshop, Tax Justice for All, Unveiling the Racial Inequity of the U.S. Tax Code. This workshop will be interactive and follow 5 families through a lifetime of tax policy impacts, exploring policies and barriers and how they have differing impacts on white families and families of color, as well as based on wealth and income levels. The goal is to communicate in everyday language that the tax code gives a lot more money to rich people than we have ever given to poor people or to the general public through spending policies. And then it looks at 15 tax policies that we could implement moving forward, and 15 spending policies that we could implement, and asks participants to make choices among those policies, and to build anew a tax policy that works for all of us. This workshop premieres next Wednesday, May 26th, and you can find out and sign up for that or any of the following sessions at networklobby.org/events. Again, thank you for being here. It's good to see you all.
Thank you, Joan and Emily. Before I introduce Brett Beasley, our next speaker, I just want to drop a note about our Q&A function. If you have any questions that have come up, I encourage you to use that function to ask them so that we can have an engaging Q&A discussion. Our next presenter is Brett Beasley, who will offer a brief response to the presentations that we just heard from Dan, Joan, and Sister Emily. Brett is the Associate Director of the Deloitte Center for Ethical Leadership at the University of Notre Dame, where he is also a concurrent assistant teaching professor of management and organization at the Mendoza College of Business. He specializes in the connection between ethics and language and narrative. He is especially passionate about translating ethical research into actionable insights that leaders can use to prevent harm, promote fairness, protect human rights, and to pursue the common good. Brett, I will turn the floor over to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Kelly, for that introduction. And thank you, Dan, Joan, and Sister Emily for your presentations and for inviting me to respond. As Dan mentioned, this topic is controversial and countercultural in a way, and I'm really grateful for the courage and the insight that you've brought to it. So I'm struck that we've been speaking about excess wages, excess income, excess profits. But we've also been talking today about a lack, I think, throughout all the presentations, especially our lack of political and moral imagination. So thank you, first of all, for helping us see some areas where we're lacking, and thanks for helping to jumpstart our imaginations. In my brief response here, I'd like to ask, where do we go from here? And of course, this will entail asking a bit more about where here is, where we are as we emerge from the COVID-19 crisis. So I thought I would start by way of context by mentioning the billionaire boom that people may have seen some articles about lately. So the 2021 Forbes billionaire list recently revealed that during the COVID-19 crisis, we have seen a surge in the number of new billionaires. Forbes added 660 names to its list to reach a record total of more than 2,700 billionaires worldwide. So most of us seem to recognize that there's something wrong with an economy where the poor shoulder most of the impact of a pandemic. And indeed, the Financial Times has warned of a coming backlash against the ultra rich. So if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's to be careful about big predictions, but that's what it's predicting currently. And yet it does seem to be really difficult for us to arrive at a consensus about how much is too much. In 2018, a rule that came out of the Dodd-Frank Act began requiring that companies of a certain size disclose the ratio between the top salary in the company, usually the CEO, and the median salary in the company. And the results have been really mixed. So most people think that it's wrong for a CEO to make thousands of times more than the median worker does, as some CEOs do. But what's the right number, or the right way to think about determining the right number? Is there much hope of even just in our culture coming to a consensus about something like a maximum living wage? Certainly, I think one thing that this new data helps us with is to see whether gaps are getting smaller or larger. And perhaps we can say, along with our colleague George Enderle, who has written that corporations have a responsibility for less income inequality, even if we can't state some agreed upon ideal. But at the same time, how should we recognize that not all billions and therefore not all billionaires are created equally? So although Americans tend to think of tech CEOs as the archetypical billionaire, in many places around the world, that's not the case. The Financial Times also recently made a distinction between good billionaires and bad billionaires, with the good ones being involved in broader innovation and wealth creation, and the bad ones are involved in industries that are more obviously extractive, like oil and gas or something like that. So whatever you think about that distinction, it suggests another way to make it more likely that when people do find high levels of success, they do so in a way that creates opportunities for other people as well. So I guess my first question is, do we in our culture or in our policies need better norms about what sorts of ceilings are acceptable? Or do we encourage industries and practices that are likely to create wealth for a broad group of stakeholders? So to oversimplify that a little bit, we could maybe ask, should we focus on having fewer billionaires or better billionaires? And I've put these questions in the chat for our panelists in case you want to take a look at them as I go through. So then my second question really has to do with something that's at the heart of the Just Wage Initiative itself. The question about what Catholic social teaching can contribute, and also relatedly what its limits might be. So for those who haven't taken a close look at this criterion in the Just Wage Initiative website, I'll remind us of those three factors that Kelly mentioned at the beginning of our session that go into this criterion. And each of these is drawn from a reading of Catholic social teaching. So the first one is that the wage policy should inhibit extreme inequality between the highest and lowest earners, that the wage structure should promote sustainability of the enterprise over the long term in the interests of all stakeholders. And lastly, that the wage structure should exhibit proportionality within a wider economic community. So if terms like extreme inequality and sustainability and proportionality feel frustratingly vague, they do mirror the language of Catholic social teaching documents. So while on the one hand, Catholic social teaching offers a prophetic call that wages should not grow beyond their due measure, to quote directly from one of these documents, quite often it leaves judgments about particular situations and models up to the determination of citizens and governments and organizations. Still, at the same time, Catholic social teaching does give something very close to an official endorsement to some ideas that are still hotly debated in our society. Caritas in Veritate speaks very positively about stakeholder capitalism, or something fitting that description. And to Dan's point in his presentation, Catholic social teaching has always, from the beginning, from Rerum Novarum in 1891, recommended some sort of profit sharing or equity-based compensation. The idea being that every worker who works in some sort of enterprise ought to have some ownership stake. So my question is, how much concrete guidance does Catholic social teaching give us about what we should do about excessive wages and gaps between the high and low income earners? And what are we missing in our current discourse that Catholic social teaching might be leading us to? So that's my second question. And then lastly, I wanted to ask a question about education. So I began by noting the poverty of our moral and political imagination. And now I'd like to ask what role education plays in renewing that. So there used to be, as Dan alluded to, a robust conversation both in Christian and classical texts about certain vices like avarice or pleonexia, as it's called in the classical world. That those being the idea that accumulation beyond what's necessary or what's beneficial is a vice. But they appear to have disappeared from our conceptual grammar and sometimes our literal vocabularies. So we might think of other principles as well that just seem to be absent. The idea of the common good, or maybe the idea of the universal destination of goods, some of these kind of core awarenesses and insights from Catholic social teaching. At the same time, we've also seen how lacking many members of the public are in some basic financial literacy, or about things like marginal tax rates and how they work. So it was great to hear about some of Network's educational opportunities. Of course, here at Notre Dame, we're also engaged in the practice of both moral and theological education, and we're training people who will go out and work in education in a variety of ways. So if you had to answer the question, what do we need to be teaching and how do we need to be teaching it in order to cultivate some of the imagination that we have lost, what would you say to those? So those are my questions, and those are also in the chat for all of our panelists if you wanted to refer back to the kind of core question there.
I'll defer to my sisters at Network if they're interested in addressing any of Brett's good prompts. Does anybody want to go first?
Well, that's a lot, Brett. I mean, let me just say it that way to begin with. And I guess the strand that continues to come to me as I think about your questions is, and including, what does education have to add to this, is the need for and the sort of the centrality of the principle of solidarity. That what is missing in our current, not just in our discourse, but in the way that we have constructed our society, and particularly as it reveals itself in our economic relationships with one another and with society, is that we lack both the understanding of and the acceptance of not only the dignity of every human person and the commitment to that requires that everyone be able to thrive and to live the best life they can live as humans, but also the fact that we're all in this together. Every action creates some sort of a reaction and an impact. And so to the extent that we have people who are, I'll use the term hoarding, financial assets and wealth, and refusing to acknowledge a responsibility that they have as people who share this society that we live in to others to ensure that they have all of their basic needs met and are able to live lives of dignity. That's the extent to which I think our society is poor in spirit, let me say it that way.
Yeah, Emily, do you want to go, or should I? I mean, I could build on Joan's comment, but I'm happy to.
Yeah, I would just add that I really appreciated your framing of the imagination and the role of the imagination. And I think vocabulary is so important in developing that role of the imagination. If we don't have the vocabulary, we think about things differently when we name them. And so having that vocabulary, I think, can really stimulate the imagination. When I was in school, I was Jesuit educated. I did not go to Notre Dame, but we had a required class for everybody called Literature and the Moral Imagination. And I think I appreciate that so much more now than I would have, than I did at the time. The idea of literature and the moral imagination, and that dreaming of another world being possible. So thank you for highlighting that.
I mean, building on Joan's and Emily's points, and maybe answering or trying to address Brett's first question about the place of billionaires in a good society. I mean, Joan's point about the way in which we, even though we're all in this together and are all interconnected, and our just wage framework is designed to show that you can't easily disentangle the criteria from each other, that they all intersect and interact together. This is the same with relationships. So often we construct our relationships as sort of households that are not connected to neighbors, or employers that are not connected beyond getting work from a worker and making that paycheck, but owing nothing more. I think the sort of need to see relationships is really critical. The pandemic seemed to show us this, that how much we do rely as a society on essential workers, very broadly defined. Whether that's going to translate into some tangible changes is another question. But it's interesting in thinking about the excessiveness question. Like, I know lots of people who will support raising the minimum wage, support protections for workers, but don't want to support greater taxation at the top. They don't want to see that the floor is so connected to the ceiling. You can't have a building without both of those. They're connected by the walls. If the walls are policies and our relationships, that's really critical. And that's what stumps me when people talk to me about, well, we don't want to stifle innovation. I would be in favor, in answer to Brett's question, of maximum wages, whether that's through progressive taxation, or in addition to that, with some sort of rules for big companies that employees, the median, must have a relationship to the top pay. I think there's different ways that can be done. Yes, I would call on private sector actors to implement it themselves. A few have. But it really does require legislation and policy changes. And I guess one of the things I struggle with is, it seems like often we pit false binaries. It's like, are unions the answer, or is government the answer to solve problems? And so often you don't choose one path or the other. When there are periods of social change and transformation, it's periods that government is acting in response to and on top of social movements, and thereby fueling social movements and their demands. And, the minimum wage in this country was at its peak purchasing power in 1968, which you could argue was about the peak of the labor movement. So, having strong independent worker organizations is not an instead of to tax policy from the government. It's workers through their vehicles lobbying, advocating, making demands that produce, I think, favorable policies that are more inclusive and help workers. And the last thing I'll say on that, I could go on and on, is is the, I'm blanking on what I wanted to say. But it's not an instead of, it's a both and that's the challenge today when you might have a narrow, thin Democratic majority ready to do things in Congress, and that's a challenge. The president seems to want to push an agenda that dovetails with a lot of what we've been talking about, a more inclusive economy, but without strong, vibrant unions or other vehicles working outside of Congress, it makes it harder for the president and vice president to pass their agenda. So, so anyway, thank you for the question. We don't need more billionaires. I prefer fewer. Oh, the one final thing, this is what I was going to say, is it's interesting, earlier billionaire Andrew Carnegie, famous American, Scots-born American immigrant, another story of immigrants helping make America. But Carnegie was, the leading steelmaker of his era and transformed the industrial economy. One of the ways he chose to give back, as he would put it, was to match funding with local communities to build local libraries that are public libraries that are called Carnegie Libraries. And it's interesting that Walter Reuther's hometown of Wheeling, West Virginia, where Walter was growing up, Wheeling had a very strong labor community, and his father, Reuther's father, was an active member of the labor movement. And they voted to not accept Carnegie's offer to build a local library because they saw it as, this is not the way a public institution should be built. It should be funded through general revenue and not somebody trying to make amends for their labor policies and how they made their fortune. So, these moral questions about how money gets made and what is the responsibility of those. I wish that we had universal standards of higher floors, some ceilings, so that we didn't have to rely on the decision-making of philanthropists or great billionaires. Sorry I went on so long. And the second question, seriously, these two should be help us talk about the uses and limits of Catholic social teaching and its language and whether that needs help. I'm interested to hear what they have to say.
When it comes to Catholic social teaching, it's in its current state, in its most accepted state, it's mostly just a theoretical framework. And the conclusions that it draws sometimes aren't relevant in certain social contexts. I think it's up to us in a lot of spaces to translate those into context. And so, for example, last night we talked about the kind of interrelated concepts of treating workers with dignity and the inherent dignity of work. And while they're related, they are not the same. You treat workers with dignity because they are human, not because they are workers, not because they have achieved something. They have not earned the right to be treated with dignity or to have a basic living standard. But work itself has dignity, whether it's paid or unpaid. And that's the dignity of co-creation and of working, of using that piece of ourselves that is the creative spirit of the God in whose image we are made. And so when you think about the idea of living wages as part of just work, well, that's a very, to my mind, that's a very contextual conclusion to draw, because it is through work in our society that we get the wages we need to live in our society. And so because of that reality, the conclusion is that we have to have living wages. So I would ask the question of, what would Catholic social teaching say about something like a universal basic income? We might, when we talk tax policy, we might look at kind of floors or subsidies to income, like the earned income tax credit or the child tax credit, as well as basic services provided by the state, as kind of answering some of that kind of tension between work as earning the right to be human, or work as inherently dignified, and the right to be human being separated from work, the right to having a basic income being linked to that basic human dignity that each and every person has.
I guess the only thing I think I could add to that, Emily, that was great, is that, I think we can appreciate the fact that Catholic social teaching provides us with a moral framework, a kind of a conceptual moral framework, and it's not a list of commandments, because it allows us to then apply it over time as circumstances change and as society changes. And so the question I think today, and Brett, thank you for asking this question. I don't have the answer, but what does CST say to us generally about our lives together as economic beings in this society, in this period of time in our history? And the fact that I didn't realize, or I hadn't seen the Forbes list, but the fact that we created more billionaires during a pandemic, when people were having to put their lives on the line just simply to put food on their table and pay their rent, to me is scandalous. And so I guess, the next iteration of that, the next level of that is the question: what can Catholic social teaching tell us today about the nature of the relationship economically between, people who are at the margins and the people in between and the people who are at the top? And what do we owe each of those levels of human beings? And so maybe Dan, some of your classes, and Brett, some of your students can help to define that more specifically. But I do think that that's part of what policymakers and legislators have to try to translate. And I see, at least from my perspective, a hugely important missing ingredient is the political will to apply a moral perspective to policymaking. And hopefully that's where organizations like ours, who come to it, and people who are associated with us who come to it with that moral perspective, might be able to be of some help to move things forward.
Yeah, I'll just building on Emily and Joan's comments. I mean, our Just Wage Working Group started with Catholic social teaching to try to find a common vocabulary and language that would allow us, coming from different academic disciplines, to talk to each other and to do those things that Joan was just insistently reminding us, that CST is very relational. It exposes, because of its holistic approach to understanding society and its demand that we see everyone connected to each other, that was really helpful in us coming together and trying to devise some sort of framework that was inclusive and encompassing, even though it's really hard to do so. At the same time, CST is limited on some things more than others. And, I would argue it's less helpful sometimes, even though it speaks a language of inclusion and the dignity of every human person. It doesn't offer the greatest guide for thinking about racial justice, I don't think, and gender justice. And so it's inviting enough that we can fill that in. But one of the most exciting developments to me in our current political moment is people just will not anymore allow class questions to be separated from race and gender questions. And that's the real exciting thing. Like, when I look at the past, my goal is not to resurrect the UAW as it existed under Walter Reuther in 1958, because, well, Reuther and the UAW were racial liberals pushing for the Civil Rights Act and helping achieve that. At the same time, it was a largely white union, like the labor movement as a whole, and was pretty committed to a breadwinner economy that didn't comfortably understand a place for women's equality either. So the point is not to use the past and go back and reproduce it exactly, but to sort of now, you sort of look back at that, see what worked and what ideas they were considering, and then in our newer contexts where we're not going to allow for the reproduction of those hierarchies, to see what can be claimed. I mean, today's labor movement is way more diverse than Walter Reuther's. And if you take polls of people, workers of color and women are way more supportive of unions than white men. So it's been flipped in that sense since 50 years ago. But this is an exciting time. I think the urgency of making sure that we see the close coupling of class and race in American history and the need to make racial justice a part of our economic strategies. It's going to be hard. And we've seen the last decade of the challenge of that, of trying to overcome resistance to that. But in any case, I wanted to call back to Joan's emphasis on the tax code being about racial and gender justice as much as worker justice. You can't disentangle them.
And I think that that calls us to ensure that the voices that have traditionally been left out of the conversation, the discussion, the decision-making tables are now included, deliberately invited into the conversation so that, there is a sort of a full circle discussion of what impacts might be not seen, might be invisible to the eyes of people whose situation in life are different.
Great, thank you all so much. I think I might jump in just to give our attendees an opportunity to ask their questions. The first question that I'm going to ask is a combination of two that we have received. So it reads, the tax code is very complex. Instead of increasing the complexity of the code, wouldn't it be better to simplify the code to focus on simply raising revenue? And I think the second part of that question is, what is the role of enforcement in enforcing the tax code and closing loopholes, things like that, for tax justice? If anybody wants to take that question.
I can jump in and answer the second question first. The IRS recently released a report that estimated that the top 1% of earners in our nation hide about 21% of their income, meaning that it is untaxed, even though it should be, and that the estimates range from $5 to $7 earned back in tax revenue for every dollar spent in enforcement. That is a significant part of the conversation right now in terms of providing the IRS the funds that it needs to enforce tax law. And it's important to note as well that historically tax audits have gone to folks who are claiming the earned income tax credit, those low income earners who might be seeking refundable tax credits, as opposed to those who actually make up the lion's share of the tax base at all, which are the billionaires and so forth, the super wealthy. So it's really important to think about that as a racial justice issue as well. The earned income tax credit, the tax code is complicated, it's complex, and so occasionally I have a friend who's a tax lawyer. Occasionally there's folks that just misunderstand something and inaccurately claim the earned income tax credit, but usually it's not malicious. But if you're actively hiding 21% of your income, that seems to me to be a lot more malicious. And to actively go after that, where that could actually make a significant difference in raising revenue for some of these spending programs.
Yeah, I would say the question about how we should raise revenue and shouldn't the tax code be made simpler. I'm all in favor of simplifying a tax code as long as it's redistributive. If simplifying it means it's regressive in any way, I'm not in favor of it. It needs to be redistributive. In terms of enforcement, and this gets back to my earlier point about the periods of greatest enforcement of government laws, whether it's the IRS and taxes or OSHA and the safe and healthy workplace. I mean, is really correlates with strong independent social movements and a more widely shared prosperity. Greater equality produces a government that is invested in retaining that. And there've been some recent studies showing the corruption of such an unequal distribution of wealth in actually preventing laws from being passed or enforced that will harm that wealth or reduce that wealth. And that's a real puzzle, a real challenge. So, I think the Biden administration really is proposing the IRS being beefed up. That strikes fear in lots of Americans, but it should be the Americans who have the wealth to hide. I mean, it's insane that today you're more likely to get audited if you live in the poorest county in Mississippi than if you live in the wealthiest counties in the country. Something is wrong with that picture as a revenue generating, efficient government point of view, as much as a justice point of view. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that simplifying the tax code is great as long as it accounts for proportionality. That is the rub that I think is being hidden by the complicated tax code, by the complications in the tax code itself. So.
Very good. Thank you all. This is a question mostly for Emily and Joan, and Dan, if you'd like to jump in too. The tax code seems so bureaucratic and chiseled, and it seems like it's something that's kind of handed down from above almost. Other than lobbying, what are ways to get involved in changing the policies of the tax code? It seems like something that's very difficult to change, but if you have any practical guidance for our viewers.
I mean, I would say help change the public conversation. The public conversation is what drives policy change. We can see that over the past several years, decade or so, that the conversation towards raising top marginal tax rates has been just a huge, it's been like a snowball, a slowly building conversation, and now it's actually making substantive difference at the policymaking level. And so we're at a critical point where we're asking that question, are we going to get these policies through? And so especially right now, continuing to talk to folks about that and build the public. We know that the majority of folks of all parties actually increase their support of the American Jobs and American Families plans when it's mentioned how they are going to be paid for with taxes on the super wealthy. So we know that that's broadly popular, and continuing to raise that up as part of the narratives to make sure that that gets put in place, I think, is a really important thing. And then you as citizens can certainly do your share of lobbying. You don't have to be policy experts to do that. Making phone calls, writing letters to the editor that name your representative or senator, or even going on constituent visits with your local offices can be really, really powerful and effective ways of creating policy change.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would just say, start to educate yourself about what actually the tax code contains, not the sort of logistics of applying the tax code, but what are the impacts of the tax code? What are the impacts of the provisions in the tax code? And you can do that, on your own, basically, just by doing a lot of reading. There's a lot of writing right now that is addressing these issues. And so I would just find something that's comfortable for you, that you can understand and digest, and get into it and learn. And then do what Emily suggested, which is to join with other people, raise your voices, organize, and let the people on Capitol Hill and at state level and local level governments know that you want and you demand change.
Great. Brett, I would love to bring you into the conversation too. I really appreciated the term moral imagination that you used. And I just wanted to know if there's any advice, anything that you would suggest on maybe explaining why we're so hesitant to bring a moral language into policy discussions, especially things like the tax code, things like equality. And then if there are practical ways that we can start to develop that moral language in ourselves and then actually bring that to the policy floor.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I often think one of the main obstacles that we have with students in a business environment, for example, but also as it relates to things like the tax code, and I think Joan set us up nicely for this conversation, that one of the biggest things is that, as I always kind of say, you bring all your values to the work that you do. That there's not some kind of code we talk about in the business ethics classes. There's not some other kind of code of business ethics that gets to ignore or limit our other values that should be showing up. So I think the good news for all of us is that we do have these values. We often just enter certain contexts where we feel like we have to shut them off. And for some reason, maybe it's our sort of cultural ideas about prosperity that Dan was sort of mentioning earlier, that we feel like some of these principles don't get activated for us when we think about this area. And I'm intrigued by what Joan said about solidarity. I think that probably, you named the one that I think is probably most core, that there's certain aspects of our life, our economic life, that we just don't think about ourselves as much in connection with other people as we really ought to. So I guess, the first answer is that we just have to invite that awareness that we already have into that context of our lives. And I really think that's the first step.
Thank you, Brett. I think we have time for one more question from an attendee. And this is, if there are any other countries that we can look to for help or for guidance on the question of not having an excessive wage, is there any guidance from any external sources, or do you look mostly to the US context?
Well, I mean, others can chime in. The US is the most extreme, the most, you might say, hyper-capitalist in terms of an emphasis on wealth accumulation and limited government amongst what you might call its peer countries in terms of wealth per capita. So, I mean, it's been a global phenomenon with the US driving the global economy towards increasing inequality and less sort of more neoliberal, less regulatory framework protecting citizens and workers. So I do think, there's all sorts of comparative work is really important. Canada is much like the US, although it's much smaller, and its unionization rate hasn't dipped as nearly, and it has a stronger social safety net than the US. We should look at why that is. Countries from Germany to the Scandinavian countries have much more protections for workers, as well as inhibit the extremes of inequality versus the US. So I would say learning world history by looking at every place other than US, and then trying to think of the US as not always good on every matter, which is something that Americans are taught to think, that American exceptionalism is always a positive, not a negative. It's important to place it in that context. Others might have some other suggestions, but I'd say look everywhere.
I would name the work of Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. They wrote a book several years ago called The Spirit Level, and have probably the most accessible is Richard Wilkinson's TED Talk on inequality, but really did a significant amount of public health research into determining that the most unequal societies are the worst off in terms of health outcomes from kind of all aspects. And this is true across the states of the United States as well. They did state by state comparison data. And the conclusion that they draw really is that it doesn't matter by which mechanism you get to greater equality. What matters is that you are at greater equality. And so some nations do it by progressive taxation and redistribution. Some nations, I think Japan was one of those, do it by just having greater equality in the economic system already. And so there are multiple approaches by which we can get at this. In our context, given the way that we tend to operate, the way that we have culturally defined successful businesses, I see the best, most practical way forward being through the tax code, in terms of building that broad-based building towards equality. But I think that there are certainly organizations, companies that have started doing that already, and that's really important to expand that as well.
I think another criteria you might use to make a comparison is, in terms of countries, is sort of work-life balance. So are there countries, certainly there are countries that are better at that than the United States. And why is that so? What makes up a work-life balance that that is appropriate, that helps people to round out their lives, to be able to live in not just in dignity, but also in fullness in terms of our reaching our full humanity. And so those kinds of criteria might be things you could look at to make that comparison as well.
Thank you, Joan. I think that's a wonderful last word, especially as we transition into the weekend. So thank you all again for attending this session of the Just Wage Forum. And just as a quick reminder, we'll hope to see you on June 11th at 1 p.m. for our next session, which is focused on Criterion 6, A Just Wage Enables Participation. We'll hear from Naomi Williams, Damon Silvers, and Kevin Cristiano. So we will look forward to seeing you then. Thank you all again. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Brett.
Thank you, Kelly, and thanks everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too. Bye now.